My name is Jason Grant. I am the co-founder of the Go Law Group PLLC. I'm also the president of the Washington Bar Association Educational Foundation Incorporated. The Washington Bar Association Educational Foundation is the nonprofit arm of the Washington Bar Association. We are dedicated to providing scholarships to law students, including our Charles Hampton Houston Scholarship, as well as the Chief Judge Eugene Hamilton Scholarship. We also provide educational programming like today. Tonight's event, COVID-19 and the law, the effects of the pandemic on access to justice. We're going to be focusing specifically on DC and Maryland with our special guests. We have attorney Albert A.J. Amissah. He is a graduate of Benedict College, graduated Benedict in 2013, cum laude. After graduating Benedict College, he attended Southern University Law Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. After a year at Southern University, he transferred back home to his native DC and transferred to the University of the District of Columbia School of Law. While attending UDC, he participated in the Legislative Clinic and Special Education Clinic. AJ graduated cum laude from UDC in 2016. After graduating from UDC, he worked for the Children's Law Center in DC as guardian ad litem and special education attorney. While at the Children's Law Center, he represented a number of children, parents in disciplinary hearings, IEP hearings, abuse and neglect hearings, and juvenile hearings, mental health proceedings. AJ left the Children's Law Center in August 2018 to start his own criminal defense firm, Amissah and Marsh law firm. AJ is also the founder of the Brown Bag Project DMV, a nonprofit organization aimed to support and advocate for individuals experiencing homelessness. Thank you for joining us, AJ. Our other panelist is Sabrina Thompson. Sabrina is a passionate litigator, motivated by her desire to help her clients solve their legal problems. Those who have encountered Ms. Thompson in the courtroom will attest to her zeal and fervor in advocating for her clients. Sabrina Thompson is an experienced trial attorney with years of success in trial work. Clients describe her as thorough, competent, and willing to fight. Sabrina established her law firm, the Thompson Legal Group, in 2012. Prior to that, she served the state of Maryland as an assistant public defender. She has spent more than a decade litigating and advocating on behalf of individuals facing legal injustices in the areas of immigration and criminal law. Her most recent focus has been serving immigrants in the community by helping them achieve the American dream through naturalization and other means. With her extensive experience, Sabrina understands how to best navigate the United States immigration and criminal law systems. Sabrina is a proud graduate of the Howard University School of Law, as well as the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. He's been distinguished as among the nation's top trial attorneys, rated as a super lawyer, Young Lawyer of the Year in Maryland for commitment to community service, as well as a 40 Under 40 Social Innovation Fund, a group that recognizes young leaders in the community. She is also a proud wife and mother of two wonderful children. And in her spare time, Sabrina enjoys volunteering, giving her time to issues she's passionate about, and dancing. So everyone, welcome Sabrina Thompson to our event tonight.
Thank you.
So we're gonna get started right off the bat. I'll start with you, AJ. What do you think are the biggest changes you've seen in the court since the beginning of the pandemic?
Well, I see the biggest changes is the fact that there are more people being held now. In the beginning, DC Superior Court was releasing a lot of individuals, but I think what happens once those individuals pick up additional charges, the courts go through their procedures of seeing if they can still protect the community, ensure that the person won't commit any other crimes. And I mean, a lot of individuals are now being held indefinitely. And that is the huge change. Also, the other huge change is just being able to speak to your client once they are held. I think I have a very hard time sometimes even getting a legal call or even getting an approval to go to the jail, because the whole process now is usually you can just show up to the jail. Obviously, you can't do that anymore. So you have to send a letter to the jail, have them approve it, send it back, and then print it out. And then if times don't match up, when you get to the jail, they'll turn you away. And so it becomes an arduous process sometimes just seeing your client. And if you have a preliminary hearing the next day, it's like you don't really have time for those type of like barriers. So those are the biggest changes. Beforehand, it was just go to the jail. I need to speak to my client. I can get in and out in 30 minutes. Now it's like a two hour trip.
Sabrina, what about you? What have you seen as the biggest changes since the beginning of the pandemic?
The most significant change that I'm seeing is delay. And so cases, both my immigration cases and my criminal cases, are taking much longer to get resolved, which creates a lot of anxiety for my clients because obviously they're facing difficult times when they're dealing with these government entities. And so the longer things drag out for them, the worse it is. So unfortunately, I mean, it's to be expected because of the pandemic, but unfortunately, delay is the biggest problem that we're seeing.
Now, AJ just talked about, sort of barriers in seeing his clients. Have you experienced that in Maryland?
So I don't have as many jail clients these days. We do have more restrictions. Like AJ mentioned, we can't just go to the jail like we used to do pre-pandemic. There is a process for phone calls in most jurisdictions. Every jurisdiction is different. That's another thing. So even though I practice throughout the state of Maryland, each county runs their system the way that they want to. Some counties will allow you phone visits that are supposed to be secured because typically jail phone calls are all recorded. However, these attorney calls are supposed to not be recorded and they're supposed to be private. Other counties will afford you an opportunity to come in and see the client, but you do have to go through a whole, protocol, a whole process to get that done. I haven't done too much of that since the pandemic has hit, thankfully, I guess. So, it hasn't been too much of a problem for me.
And AJ, I'll start with you on this question. What are kind of the constitutional or rights concerns you're having with regards to the delays and with, not having access, the immediate access to your clients, maybe in jail?
Well, I mean, I guess the first obvious one would definitely be like a speedy trial issue. And then also, I mean, I think, and I don't really know if this answers your question, but I think a lot of my clients are just taking the plea now, right? And I talked about this in a different podcast before, but there are certain charges that at some point when a client looks at being held indefinitely, he's like, man, if you're talking about giving me 6 months, even though it's a felony, I might still take the 6 months because I'll get out before I even actually have a trial. And it's hard to really counsel someone to not take a plea, when, they kind of, it's a logical thing at some point, right? Like if I'm just going to sit here, I might as well take the CPWL, even though they didn't find a gun on me and have no evidence of showing that it was in my possession. So that's one issue I think I have. And I think that goes connected with the speedy trial, right? If they had their 100-day trial because they're being held, that wouldn't be of issue. But because I have a guy now who, he just recently got released like 2 months ago, but it was a simple assault. He was held for over 400 days.
Wow.
And the only reason why he wasn't still being held and there was no trial is because the OAG refused to take the case. They had one of the Jackson findings, so they wanted to hold him indefinitely for mental health concerns. But 400 days for simple assault, that's like 2 times the maximum penalty for that. So that's kind of the issue I'm actually having, not to kind of like talk in circles, but is that people are being held way longer than the maximum term of the penalty. The government is refusing to dismiss those cases in those instances. And they're kind of using, I think sometimes, the advantage of the system to kind of force people into pleas.
Now, do you find that courts are trying to find some alternative ways to adjudicate these cases. I'll start with you, Sabrina.
I have seen that. So with the issue of, let's say, bail, right? So the county that I practice the most in, I would say, is Prince George's County. That's where my office is located. So I do tend to get a lot of clients who have cases here in Prince George's. And prior to the pandemic, the bail system, well, we have a cash bail system in our state anyway, but it was very routine for judges to issue a cash bail as a requirement for people to be released. However, since COVID hit, we are seeing a lot of no cash bail, either release on recognizance or unsecured bail, which means basically you promise to pay an amount of money if you miss your court date, but you don't have to pay anything outright. And then we're also seeing the judges use the pretrial release system more. So the pretrial release is an agency within the court system that will monitor a person if they're deemed to be a higher flight risk, and the judge doesn't want to just let them out. Then they'll put them like on an ankle monitor or some other program like that through the pretrial release system. So we're seeing that being used more. I think our courts are trying to be sensitive to, the idea of COVID and not keeping people, particularly lower offenses, misdemeanors and the like, keeping them in jail and risking, illness and all of that for a minor offense. Our jails obviously were already overcrowded, before this circumstance. So yeah, we are seeing some of that being used more.
And AJ, what about DC? I think DC is thinking of restarting jury trials maybe next month. Have you seen courts trying to adjust and get some alternative ways to kind of adjudicate these cases so that they're not just being held as much? Or is it just, they're just allowing defendants to stay in jail for extended?
No, and I agree with Sabrina. I think that there are a lot of judges and a lot of judges that are allowing individuals to get out on nonviolent offenses, or even violent offenses based on the record, if it makes sense. But now we are starting trials. I think trials start next week for jury trials and misdemeanor trials. And I do believe we started doing in-person preliminary hearings starting this year. And so they are starting to move these cases forward. I think that there was an understanding from the court. They want a lot of these cases, especially traffic cases, to get resolved, especially like a no permit, figure it out, right? And so, I do think that the courts are trying to find ways to push it out. I think that because also, although DC's a little place, it's a lot of people. And so I do think, as Sabrina said, our jails are already overcrowded. And our system is already overcrowded. So I do think it has been an arduous task for the judges to find equitable ways to kind of push this thing along. Because a place like DC, it's not like Maryland where you have different counties for different courts. Everyone's coming to that one court in DC Superior Court, unless it's a federal charge. So you're talking about 10 to 15,000 people daily in one courthouse, and that's a lot of people. And so I do think it has been difficult.
And Sabrina, you briefly mentioned that Maryland still has cash bail. Do you think that Maryland is, now that the pandemic has kind of shown different ways to deal with the bond system, do you think that Maryland is going to be moving towards a cash bail reform and getting rid of cash bail?
I definitely think that's the idea. I know that there has been some movement in the legislature to push, bail reform even before the pandemic hit. In Prince George's County specifically, the state's attorney, Aisha Braveboy, she had issued a policy, and I think it was pre-pandemic also, where she indicated that her office would not be asking for cash bail from going forward, and that they would just kind of defer to the court in terms of if there is a number to be set, they were no longer going to be asking for a specific amount. They would just simply either say they would like the person held or not held, kind of like a de facto, I guess, no cash bail system. So I do think that there's a push for that. Whether it will happen or not, I guess we'll just have to see, what the legislature decides.
And to follow up on that, has there been any, I guess, pushback against doing cash, a non-cash bail system and cash bail reform? Because in other jurisdictions, when they have tried cash bail reform, there has been immediate pushback. Have you seen that, particularly in Prince George's County?
I haven't, honestly, I think the no cash bail system is beneficial to the folks who are charged with the less serious offenses, which I think really covers the bulk of the dockets. It can cut both ways, though, for people who are charged with more serious offenses like violent offenses and the like, because, whereas before, if you had the money, you could pay an amount and get out. Now you won't have that alternative at all. You'll just have to sit. And so, that's a disadvantage. But I can't say that I've seen much pushback. I think that there's more support for it than opposition.
AJ, as we've talked before, DC has always been kind of ahead of the curve on this cash bail reform issue, and actually got rid of cash bail back in 1992. But do you think that there's still too many loopholes in the system that still allows people to be held for these indefinite amount of times for maybe smaller criminal charges, particularly now that we've been in this pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think now, though, where the courts are, because we're now having more status hearings, though, that individuals have an opportunity to get out, either through a bond review hearing or a detention hearing. Last year, we weren't having detention hearings, so that was a big issue for me because, well, maybe earlier last year when this first hit, we weren't having detention hearings. So, like, if a person was held at arraignment, then they were held. There was nothing you can do unless they were taking a plea. There was nothing really you could truly do. And so further on, we started having detention hearings, preliminary hearings, which allowed people to get out. But the problem without having a cash bail system is either you're held or not held. Mm-hmm. And only time you put a cash bond, typically in DC, is when someone is being held for something else and you want them to still get time for the time they're serving behind bars. And so that's kind of the issue, right? So, like, if they're not held on anything else, they're just held on this, it's kind of hard to get them out unless it's a plea or a disposition. And so when you have something to hit like the pandemic where no one knows how to operate, no one knows what's going on because it's not something that anyone's used to, that person has to sit. And it has been hard. I think Sabrina hit on this, but like clients get frustrated because they're looking at us like, what are you doing? Right? Why am I still here for shoplifting? And it's hard to kind of explain to someone why they're sitting for 180 days for a 90-day charge, but there was literally nothing we can do. And now that we're doing these bond reviews and preliminary hearings and compassionate release motions, that's one thing I didn't say before. Now it has been better, but yeah, I think that loophole, we didn't think about that beforehand, before the pandemic, about without a cash bond, like, you're going to be held. There's no way, another way of getting out unless a judge says that they feel that they can keep the community safe.
And can you explain a little more about compassionate release motions?
Absolutely. So that was actually fairly new to me. I don't know if it was new to Sabrina since she's way more experienced than I am, but I basically it is basically a motion asking the judge for deference for an individual that is being held. Typically what I have found that is more effective when someone is held after disposition for a period of time. So I had more success with individuals that have been in jail for a long period of time. And I'm asking for compassionate release at this point, given the fact that they've been held, say, 20 years out of the 25 years, they've served majority of their time. And I feel like at this point it's a Eighth Amendment issue, cruel and unusual punishment for them to be held with this virus coming around. It's also a lot more impactful for me, in my experience, when someone has some underlying health issues that are directly connected to the virus. It has been not helpful when it's a 26-year-old who's very healthy and just got to jail like 3 months ago. It hasn't been helpful for me in that particular situation. But those type of motions actually ask for, like what it sounds like, compassionate release from the judge for this individual, given the fact that no one should be in jail and should be exposed to a death sentence just because of the crime that they committed, is how I look at it.
And Sabrina, have you had any experience with that?
I haven't done any myself, but I do know when the pandemic initially hit, for instance, in Prince George's County, I remember the Office of the Public Defender and the State's Attorney's Office actually came together and submitted, I don't know if it was one big motion or several motions, but they did kind of a big push asking the court to release a number of inmates. And like AJ was saying, mostly people who were close to finishing out their sentence already, or like people who were older or had, significant health problems or what have you. And so there were a good amount of releases that happened as a result of that. I don't do too much post-conviction, meaning, work after the person has been sentenced. I don't do as much of that. So I haven't done any myself, but I have heard of people who have garnered success with those motions.
And AJ, kind of talking back about when the defendants are already in jail, either pending a jury trial or if they've already been convicted, what have you been told by your clients or what you've seen yourself regarding the conditions of the jails and any precautions, if any, that are being taken to prevent viral spread?
So I will be honest, when the pandemic first hit, I don't think the jails did a good job at all. I think the council members even said they didn't do a good job. I know I had a couple clients that got out on compassionate release motions, and they even said that there was a lot more individuals sick in the jail than the jail was actually reporting. I have had people sent upstate and from DC, and they said that DC is probably doing a 10 times better job than a lot of those prisons are doing. And so comparative, I think DC might be doing better, but I think that a lot of individuals now, even still being held, are saying the same things. Like, a lot of people are still catching the virus, then it's just not being reported. And I just think, man, when you think logically, like, man, the jail's not set up for that. So, like, the jail is very dirty. There's a lot of individuals there with an array of mental health issues. It's just not clean. But I will say, for me personally, when I go to the jail, I always see a cleaning crew coming. No matter what time I go, there's always a cleaning crew coming in and out of jail. So I can't say they're not taking precautions to try their best. I just think that, I mean, if you think logically, the jail's not set up for that. I would say that when an individual first comes to jail, what I do know is that they quarantine for 14 days. So if you're being arrested, they still quarantine. They put you on a quarantine block. The problem with it is, from my understanding, and this is just from my understanding, I think that quarantine block is mixed with individuals that have tested positive for the virus and individuals just coming straight off the street that haven't tested positive. So how that interacts with people being contained to the virus. Can you hear me? It looks like you froze.
Yeah, you froze for a little bit.
Oh, so you didn't hear anything I said?
There was when you were talking about the quarantining folks who have been tested positive and also people who have just come straight off the street. You were just about there when we froze.
All right, so yeah, I just don't know how that has played out. I think that they're basically putting people at risk for the virus, and I don't think that is smart because, as we all know, it sometimes takes up to 7 days before you show any symptoms. So if an individual is mixed with someone that has already been tested positive and then he's not showing any symptoms, but then goes on the block and now shows symptoms, he's exposing everyone. So those are the issues I think that the jail's going to have to figure out. But I do know that a lot of my clients are concerned, especially the older ones, because, I mean, they don't want to risk their life, over the virus, man, for small crimes.
Sabrina, have you noticed or have you heard from any of your clients who may have been experiencing being in prison or in jail that are also having figure out how to sort of survive and not get sick with the coronavirus.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with AJ that initially, it was just kind of madness. I can remember back in maybe April of last year when I did have a client who was jailed. And when I went to see her, they told me I couldn't because I had, gone through all the steps and we had arranged everything. But when I got there, they told me that she actually had tested positive for COVID. And so she was being quarantined and I couldn't see her. And then when I spoke to her that evening, she was like, they haven't even told me that I'm positive. So I don't even know anything about this. Like, she was telling me they just had her off in a unit by herself. She was terribly confused about what was going on. No one was giving her information. I mean, it was crazy. Thankfully, we were able to get her out quickly because that was just a bad situation. And she was somebody, so her offense, she was charged with a felony, but she was somebody who had never been in trouble before. I mean, had no kind of record, almost 40 years old, that kind of thing. And so we really played that up. And there was some history between her and the person who was accusing her and some ulterior motives that, we were able to expose to just really kind of highlight that this is not what it seems to be. And she doesn't need to be in there and at risk. But I definitely think, as AJ was saying, that in a lot of cases, they end up exposing people to greater risk than preventing. And I mean, he's right. The jails are not set up to really deal with, you can't really social distance in jail. The inmates do wear their masks and, all of that, but that does little, to help when you're surrounded by so many people in an environment, as he said, that's already not sanitary. So, I think that the jails are trying, and they kind of have to, for liability reasons and other things like that, they have to kind of do what they can do, but it's definitely a less than ideal situation, to say the least. And so on my end, I just am working doubly hard to keep my folks out of there because it's not where you want to be in this pandemic. I mean, it's not where you want to be anyway, but especially now.
AJ, so have there been, I guess, other holding alternatives like halfway houses that you may have been told by your clients are either better or worse than being in, some of the DC jail? Has you had any clients kind of tell you about those conditions?
So, no. From my understanding, the halfway houses and the drug treatment facilities, all those things were like closed once the pandemic hit. So the only other alternative, honestly, was 24-hour home confinement, which obviously is 10 times better than being at the jail. However, I haven't actually had that experience at all because from my understanding, halfway houses are still closed as of like 2 weeks ago when I tried to get one of my clients in a halfway house and it didn't go too well. But I don't think the halfway houses are open yet. I don't know if it's different in Maryland, but DC still uses Maryland halfway houses. So I'm not sure if Sabrina has a different experience than me.
Sabrina, how about you?
No, we actually don't do, I'm not even aware of any halfway houses. We don't really do that. I mean, because we have the pretrial release alternative, which is, the monitoring at home, that's the alternative to jail for people who can qualify for it.
Okay. Now we've kind of talked a little bit about it and some of the other questions and answers, but I want to talk about the prosecutors and the prosecutor's role with all of this. Sabrina, have you, since the pandemic has hit us last year, have you noticed prosecutors giving a little bit more discretion in how they're charging the criminal defendants in the different counties in Maryland?
I can't say that I have. I wish I could, and it may just, obviously this is my own personal experience, and it may just be the way that I work or what have you, but I feel that these prosecutors, in my opinion, they seem to be unmoved by this pandemic and its impact and effect. I have found in my years of practice that and I hate, I don't mean to lump all prosecutors into one group, because obviously they are individuals, and there are some who apply their own way of thinking and what have you to handling their cases. But in general, as a whole, I have found that prosecutors tend to think that, if a defendant finds themselves in a criminal court, then they should deal with whatever circumstance comes their way. So, the COVID arguments are lost on the I don't even bring them up, because they're not moved by it. Wow. That's my experience since I've been handling, cases in COVID. I have a case right now that I'm in the middle of negotiating for a young woman who's charged with marijuana. She's charged with distribution of marijuana, which is a felony, versus possession of marijuana, which would just be a misdemeanor. And, she was 19 at the time that they charged her, and she's never been in trouble before, has no prior. She was in school and not in school anymore, what have you. Anyway, the government is seeking to incarcerate her for a year. For essentially, and I mean, I understand that, they believe that she was selling marijuana, and they, that's still a crime, but we're on the cusp of marijuana pretty much being legal anyway. Right. And so, you think like, wow, you really want this girl to go sit in a jail for a year in the middle of COVID for this? So, yeah, wow. I don't think.
AJ, I saw you nodding your head when Sabrina was talking. So what's been your experience?
Oh God, Sabrina's about to bring us the altar call here, man. Like, I think it has been terrible. I agree with her 130% that the prosecutors are unmoved by the pandemic. Through arraignment, I still do arraignment every other week in DC Superior Court, because only a limited amount of attorneys can do arraignment. So we just don't have anyone exposed. In arraignment, you have people on their first charge ever. They're still asking to be held indefinitely, knowing right now we know we're doing trials, but at that time, there was no idea when we were actually going to do trials again. It didn't matter the age, it didn't matter the health conditions. You have people coming in wheelchairs. They're still asking for them to be held. It's terrible. And one of those things, I thought it was like, maybe when Trump gets out of office, things will change. It hasn't. I was just in arraignment 2 weeks ago. It hasn't changed at all. And the problem with that, though, is that we have a bigger issue with the system, right? Because, you have prosecutors, as Sabrina said, looking at individuals that find themselves in the criminal justice system as someone that should deal with the issues of the criminal justice system. But we don't really see too many prosecutors' offices getting in these communities and helping these communities out of individuals that are committing these crimes, right? You don't really see, I've never seen a prosecutor office come out and say, hey, let's go give out free lunch to these kids in DCPS schools. Not one time. So yeah, I think it's you're getting me on my Black Panther speech, but man, I think it's really an issue, because we know how deadly this virus is. It's so deadly that these prosecutors don't even come down to the courthouse.
Right.
Pandemic, they're virtual.
That's right.
So they can't even show up in the courthouse.
Right.
Doing arraignment.
Zoom asking the client to go to jail for something minor.
On the first charge. Right? Like simple assault, you want them to sit there for really a year on simple assault. It doesn't make sense. And it's actually very troubling, if you ask me, because it shows you the faults in our system, and that we don't see individuals in the criminal justice system as human. And that's a problem.
And I'm guessing that this disproportionately affects Black and brown communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's DC and PG, so like, it's only Black and brown people when they come in.
And in wider jurisdictions, I do practice in other jurisdictions in Maryland that are predominantly white. Then there, it's the lower income or the lower class folks, that are disproportionately affected.
And I'm trying to get into the minds of these prosecutors. What do you think is their motivation to continue to go about these things as business as usual? How are you, Sabrina?
I don't want to get on my soapbox here, but I think that these prosecutors, many of them, a lot of them have an agenda to gain experience, and some are politically motivated, and so they're biding their time, for their next venture or what have you, and are not so much connected to, as AJ was saying, the community that they are prosecuting and the issues that are, they're in. And so in a lot of ways, it really is just a job, for them. And while supposedly there is no reward for like getting more convictions, certainly when they get convictions, they celebrate that, and I'm not saying that there's no place for convicting people who do wrongs in our society. There is a place for that, but to overlook the fact that this is a system that disproportionately impacts a certain group of people in a way that is completely unjust, it's like it honestly, it's like unethical to me. And I mean, I say that with some hesitance because I know that there are some prosecutors out there who care and who are interested in fairness and justice, but in general, it's a system that is set up really, to do what it's doing, which is oppress, Black and brown and, low class folks. Like, that's what it does. That's what it is. And I think, we're a long way off from reforming that. You do have some places like, I have a lot of admiration for Miss Mosby in Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, who, that there you have a prosecuting agent who is seemingly anyway, really trying to effectuate some change. She stopped prosecuting marijuana charges. She has stopped prosecuting lower level offenses like prostitution and some other things, I can't think off the top of my head, but I know that there are some less serious crimes that she has said that her office is just not going to prosecute anymore. And I think that speaks volumes because it recognizes that really what that's about is oppressing a certain group of people. That's not really about keeping our streets safe or whatever, the lingo is that they use.
And sticking with you, Sabrina, how have you seen the differences with the judges and how they have sort of tried to address some of these, not only the disparities, but also being held during a pandemic and the danger that could cause? How have judges really tried to address that in their rules?
So I find that, some judges will kind of say like, almost like preempt your argument to say like, I'm already aware of all the COVID arguments, so you don't have to include that in your spiel. Like, go ahead and talk, but I'll be thinking about COVID too. Like almost as if like, we don't want to hear that because we're tired. We know that you guys are going to throw that in the mix, you guys being us defense attorneys. And then there are other judges who really will like, I've had some judges ask questions about health backgrounds. Like, does your client have any health issues that I should know about? Considering that we're in this pandemic, that shows, a thoughtfulness toward the risk, that they're facing. I definitely think judges tend to do a little bit of a better job incorporating concerns about COVID for folks. But as a whole, the system just sucks. I mean, it's an unfair and unjust system.
Mm-hmm. So AJ, what do you think? Have judges done a better job in DC as far as addressing some of these issues that we're talking about?
I would actually say yes. And so when I talk about the prosecutors asking for a hold, I have seen a lot of judges, even up to last 2 weeks ago, deny the hold, given the fact that it's just not worth holding for some of these charges. Now, if you come back on your second or third charge and without disposition, it's a whole nother story. And I think that goes on a judge by judge basis. But I would say that DC as a whole, from the judges, from my experiences, especially for non-violent offenses, have been really well at giving people second chances to be in the community. There's always a couple, right, that don't realize there's a pandemic out there. But I think as a whole, though, I think it hasn't been too much of an issue. Like I said, though, if you get rearrested, it's a whole nother conversation.
And sticking with you, AJ, how have you seen, I know you have some experience handling juvenile matters. How have you seen the courts really deal with the pandemic and processing these juvenile cases? What difference have you seen between how the adults are being processed versus our juvenile defendants?
So it's actually interesting you say that. So I would start off by saying I've seen a lot more juvenile defendants be released. However, I would say that, man, when you talk about a system, it's like indoctrinating individuals in the community. So by the time you get to being 30 or 40 years old, some of these individuals' records are so long that, the judges will tend to hold that individual before they will hold an individual that's 16 for like maybe their second offense ever, right? And a person that's 16 is typically going back home to his mom, in comparison to an individual that maybe be 40 might go right back into the streets. And so although a 16-year-old probably is going right back into the streets because it's probably where the police officers found him, it's probably where he's going right back after he's released, I do think that the judges have been a little bit more lenient because that individual, I think from their point of view, is going back into a structured environment. Whether they are or not, right, that's what it looks like. Now, I will say that a lot of my juvenile clients have ankle monitors. So that's the big difference. I think that a lot of the adult clients that are released, they're not typically released with an ankle monitor. But the POs in the juvenile cases are always saying, hey, can we get an ankle monitor on this kid just to ensure that he's coming back and forth on curfew on time? So I think it's different, but like I kind of explained to you before this, is that my experience with juvenile, I can't say if it's more or less before the pandemic because I didn't start doing juvenile cases on a panel until the pandemic. So I only know from what I see now, but like in comparison to adults and juveniles, I think that juveniles are being released more. Yeah.
And do you think that when juveniles are released, that the conditions that they have upon release are sort of conducive to getting back on more of a straight and narrow, or is it just like just make sure they come back in the court and we'll adjudicate them?
I don't think anything that we do in the system is about getting anyone on a straight and narrow, to be honest. I think it's, do you get back home on time, or are you going to school? Not do you have anything to eat? Do you have any jobs? Do you have any, like, there's no one like working with these, let me get you a counselor to talk to you or a mentor. I mean, they have those services. It's not the conversations I'm hearing in hearings. The hearings is primarily on, did he go to curfew? Has he been charged with electronic monitoring? Is he going to school? Literally, that's all. And so I think that I don't think people are too invested in, especially the kids, getting them on the straight and narrow. And as you know, man, that's like my passion. And so I know that there's more we could actually do as a whole.
We're going to come back to that, but we're going to do a little bit of a switch with the little time we have left. Talk to Sabrina about immigration. Sabrina, most often in media right now, when we hear about immigration, it's what's going on with the southern border, border crossings along the Mexico border, but other immigration issues are to be considered. How has the pandemic sort of affected processing of permanent residency applications, asylum applications, etc.?
So, as I was saying earlier, again, here, the biggest issue has been delay. When the pandemic initially hit, the U.S. embassies overseas just shut down. Like, they were just like, we're closed for business. Okay. So everything just kind of came to a screeching halt for people who were, processing applications and waiting on responses and that kind of thing. Right now, most of the embassies are operating on kind of like an emergency basis where they're doing some work, but not routine work. I think the date right now that we have is April 1st, which is what, tomorrow, for them to resume, but that could change. One of the things with immigration is that changes happen frequently and with very short notice. So, you can be under one policy today and then something comes down tomorrow and everything shifts. Like, that's just the nature of the beast. but delay is the big issue. So processing times have increased tremendously. There was already a very long backlog of cases that the government had been working on processing through. And so when things shut down and work slowed, the log just kind of increased because people were still filing their paperwork, and they needed to because there are deadlines that they have to be concerned with. Like, for instance, you mentioned asylum. When you're seeking asylum in the US, there's a 1-year clock that starts ticking, when you get here. And so you need to file your petition within that 1 year, unless you have some excuse that is going to warrant them, extending that time. So people have to be mindful of their timeline and still file the paperwork, even if nobody is processing it. So, the stack is growing and growing and growing and growing, and people are waiting longer and longer.
And have you seen delay also in like the deportation hearing process? How has that been affected?
Absolutely. I mean, so right now, so for non-detained cases, well, let me say this, the immigration courts continued to process detained cases, during the pandemic. Everything has been done virtually for the most part. And so those things were happening, but they still were at a slower pace because you can't do as many as you could if, we were all in the courtroom together. But the non-detained cases were put on hold for a while, for months. And most of the immigration courts have resumed hearing non-detained cases, but the dates are like 2, 3, even 4 years into the future. So, I mean, it's not uncommon to be at a docket in immigration court online and hear somebody get a trial date for 2025, because wow. that is the kind of backlog that we're dealing with. I mean, you see, when you mentioned the news and the headlines and the photos that we're seeing of people at the border. So all those people, particularly kids, like they're getting cases assigned and being added to the list. And so they take priority. People who have been in detention or are under the monitoring of the detention system, they get priority. And so all these other non-detained are still like, well, I'm here too, still waiting for my stuff. So we have to go to the back of the line.
Okay, wow. Well, we've come to sort of the end here. We have just a few minutes left. So what I want to ask before we open it up to questions is sort of how, my first question is going to be about 3 final questions. So how do you see the courts kind of getting back to sort of a semi-normal version of itself? Obviously, how it was before, where everybody was just sitting next to each other, all open, we're not going to be going back to that. But how do you see courts kind of opening back up into sort of a semi-normal way of getting through these cases and adjudicating these cases? And I'll start with you.
So I actually think that in a lot of ways, I think that the virtual system has added efficiency to the process. I would love to see the courts continue to incorporate virtual hearings going forward because there are many things that happen in court that, everybody comes together for like a 30-second thing. You know what I mean? Like everybody's driving from here, there, and everywhere. We get in front of the court, we're literally on the record for like a minute and we're done. So for these kind of pretrial proceedings and quick statuses and setting dates and that kind of thing, I definitely think keeping those things on Zoom will help to be more efficient and to just kind of help things to progress more smoothly as we try to deal with all these cases that have been, held up. I do understand with like trials, those kind of things, although I've seen jurisdictions where people are having trials online, at least bench trials anyway. I've heard one story about somebody who picked a jury over Zoom. I just saw it on Facebook. I didn't really get into it, so I don't know how that worked. So let me just say this. In Maryland, we had actually gone back to jury trials for like, I want to say a week or 2 before that got shut down again because the numbers spiked. And so they reverted back to a more limited operating status. So right now we're still not at jury trials again until I think the end of next month. But trials, I get it, in person is fine. But if we could do some kind of hybrid of Zoom for the quick stuff and just reserve the in-person meetings for the bigger things, I think that could help a lot to get us back to normal.
And AJ, what about you? What do you see as a sort of getting back to semi-normal in the court?
Absolutely, I agree with Sabrina. I think that there's been plenty of times I've came all the way to court for one hearing that was 5 minutes long, if that. And it makes it even worse when your client don't show up, because now you're waiting around to see if your client will actually show up before they get a bench warrant. So I think that's what courts are going to actually do, and I think that allows us to be able to be in two places at once, especially if it's virtually. Even if I have to go to court in DC for like a preliminary hearing, I can still log on in PG County for a status hearing to set a trial date and not have to be back in the rat race. I think it allows us to be more efficient as attorneys and allows the court to move these things along. As well as if they start opening up these trials, I think that we could have been doing trials a long time ago, me personally, especially the bench trials, because there's nobody in the court. So it's safer than going to Giant most times because you're not exposed to that many people. So I think that if we push forward with these trials and these virtual hearings as much as needed, I think we'll be light years beyond where we were before.
And sticking with you, AJ, talking about solutions, and I want to go back to the conversation we're having about juvenile justice. What do you see as solutions to bettering the system for our younger defendants?
So I think that DC has a great model when it comes to some of the programs like the juvenile diversion program, behavior diversion program, where you have a kid, he has a special education attorney. If he has educational issues, he has a behavior therapist, he has an attorney, and monthly you meet, right? Discuss how the kid is progressing and everything else, right? The problem with it is, I think that until we first address the issue of policing in our communities, like holistically, let's not talk over it, right? Racism is a huge issue when it comes to policing. I will tell you, I had a client, while they were tearing up the Capitol on a riot, be stopped in front of Chinatown and harassed while he was just walking down the street and searched for a gun. You have individuals, number of them, breaking into the Capitol, but he was worried about this one 15-year-old walking down the street in Chinatown, because it's been ingrained in these police officers that these young black boys are almost terrorists in their minds, when the real terrorists were tearing down the Capitol. And so until we address those real issues, man, I think it's going to be a problem. I think that we're going to still have the system disproportionately bringing in black people into the system. And DC is not even over 50% black anymore, right? But the only people you see coming in are black. I think until we really have the system addressing housing, right, education, and mental health, I think that if those components aren't addressed, then the system's never going to change. It's going to work as it was designed, right? Because it was designed to create those issues, right? Inadequate housing, inadequate education, and put individuals in a system of pressure that creates an array of mental health issues, right? The pressure of racism in this country. So I think that we have to have more thoughtful conversations like we're having now, but also have more thoughtful solutions and more people on the ground, as me and you both are, Jason, and probably Sabrina. I don't know her, but she looks like someone that's there, but that is willing to get out there and help people, feed people, right? Talk to people and be there. We got to be present. I think it's the main thing right now is present. Us. We don't need anybody else. We just need us. And I think we can do it. And I think we can make really a lot of waves in the system.
Sabrina, what do you think about that? How do you see solutions to some of these issues that we've talked about today?
I agree with what AJ has had to say. I do think that there's a holistic approach that's necessary. I know it's controversial, but I, for one, am someone who supports the movement to defund the police. I do think that, taking some of these resources from the police agency and putting them into, services that really can help our people and give them what they need is a much better use, of the funds. I think taking these police out of our communities, I mean, they're literally sitting around our neighborhoods, right? Just patrolling, just sniffing around, just hemming people up. What are you doing? Where are you going? All of that, looking for problems and just, making it difficult for people to just, people who look like you and me, of course, to just live and breathe and thrive, And so I definitely think it starts, with services and with cutting back on police, because I mean, they're the problem. They start these cases by charging folks, overcharging folks and unnecessarily charging folks. And I think that's where we need to look as a starting point.
And Jason, I know you're about to go, but like I want to build off of what Sabrina was saying. I'm a huge component. I'm a huge supporter of defunding the police, and because I don't think sometimes they serve a purpose. And I think when you have a failing education system, those politicians take money out of that system, right? It's in the law. So why can't we take money from the police when they're not serving the community, which they're designed to do? But even in DC, I mean, in certain communities, when you look on a body cam, some of these cases, they have individuals. It's disgusting to me because they have individuals so ingrained that when they're walking, they're like, "Show me your waistband." You have people lifting up their shirts, violating all types of constitutional protections, only because they're so ingrained that if they don't do it, the reaction from the police is going to be far greater. That's a problem, right? And as long as that's continuing to happen in our community, where's the justice? I'll even go further than that. My law partner was walking his dog about 2 months ago. Walking his dog, my law partner, right? Walking his dog in basketball shorts and flip-flops. 6 police officers jumped out on him while he was walking his dog and told him he looked like he had a gun. Said he had a bulge. He had his cell phone in his hand, no wallet on him. And then when they didn't find a bulge, they wouldn't give them their names. They wouldn't give them their badge numbers. They just drove off. Because to them, it was business as usual. Mm-hmm. When he went down to the station, the police officer told him, "You were trying to be cocky, telling me you were a lawyer. You were trying to show off to us." That's what he said. Did anything come from that complaint? Obviously not, right? But that is the problem, And I mean, what if he would have resisted and got killed? That's the issue, man.
Well, we can go all day and talk about these issues. What issues we didn't really get into is with regards to policing, police unions and the acts, how, because I was reading an article about how the police union in New York, they're receiving tax money to pay for attorneys for police officers who are engaged in police conduct, when the city has decided that they don't want to represent the police officer. The union is still getting tax money to pay for attorneys to represent police officers in some conduct cases. So there are issues within the courts, within the general justice system, the police system, that definitely need to be addressed. Obviously, we can't address them today because we have to go. But before we do go, we want to see if there are any questions in the chats for our panelists before we go. Anyone want to have a question for any of our panelists? Do so now, because we're about to wrap up in the next couple minutes. Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank our awesome panelists, Albert, Amissah. Thank you for all the work that you do, and good luck with everything in your law firm, Amissah and Marsh. Ms. Sabrina Thompson of the Thompson Legal Group, thank you for your work in the community and your work representing defendants. Hopefully we will have more discussions like this to get more solutions for our community and greater justice work in the not only during this pandemic, but post-pandemic and in the future. Also want to thank President Tony Towns for the Washington Bar Association, who was able to join us for the last part of this event. The Vice President of the Washington Bar Association Educational Foundation, Charlene Stanberry, for helping out and putting this event together. Thank you everyone for attending. It was a great panel, and we'll see each other soon, hopefully in person the next time we have a panel discussion. All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.